All right. Well, welcome everyone. This is episode 3. I entitled this episode Finding Christ in the Old Testament. My name is Benjamin Allen. This is a biblical theology podcast that tries to make sense of the various symbols, types, and patterns of the Bible in an effort to make the big story of Scripture become more alive to everyday reading and study. Last episode, we gave an extremely brief survey of the tree, plant, vine imagery within the Bible, particularly its varied use in creation and redemption. Today, I want to go a little deeper. I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started. So, today I want to go further into this objective of putting the whole Bible together as this one unified story by exploring some of the typological relationships between the Old Testament places, events, characters, and images and the person of Jesus Christ. Well, this is no easy task. I think it would be a fun thing to map out together, or at least look at briefly. Well, typology is the study of how Old Testament historical persons, events, institutions, and settings function to foreshadow, anticipate, prefigure, and predict the greater realities in the New Covenant age. The correlation between the Old Testament type and the New Testament antitype is not just one of analogy or basic correspondence. Rather, analogies are, just as an aside, analogies are drawn between Old Testament persons and events to New Testament persons and events. But the distinction here, typological patterns are much more. Typological patterns are perspective in that God has designed and intended certain Old Testament figures, institutions, settings, and events to serve as advanced presentations, which are then transcended and surpassed by the arrival of the New Testament antitype. Now, I've used this word a couple times, antitype. I'm going to explain what it means, simply that it's something that corresponds to or is foreshadowed in a type. So, for example, probably the most obvious example we can get from this is that Jesus Christ in the New Testament is the antitype of Adam, of so many different things in the Old Testament, but that's an example. So an antitype is this foreshadowed conclusion of a type. There's a few things that I wanted to point out. I am utilizing a resource by Stephen Wellum. I'm just going to see if I have it here in the good old library here. This is, I know it's backwards, so I apologize. It is Progressive Covenantalism by Stephen Wellum and Brent Parker, charting a course between dispensational and covenant theologies. I am reading this right now. I am really enjoying it, but it made me really look at some of the typological patterns that I figured would be cool content for this podcast. So before we get started into the meat, there's a few things that I'd like to point out, especially traversing this topic. One, we want to read the biblical text on its own terms and not on our own. Oftentimes, remember how I talked about in the first episode, we wear different lenses, and so we have to put on the lens of the biblical authors. Two, typology always has an eschatological aspect that is usually described as an escalation or heightening with the arrival of the antitype along the lines of inaugurated eschatology. It means that typology often, just to lay this out, it is always in the understanding of an end times aspect. There is always this heightening, this escalation, as it were, as the inaugurated end times comes to being. And third, it's important to recognize that when a person or entity is identified as typological, this does not include every aspect of a person or entity. So, for example, while David is a type of Christ in terms of his roles, particularly king, servant of Yahweh, and as God's son, like 2 Samuel 7:12 through 16, or Psalms 2 or Psalm 89, not everything in David's life, such as his sinful actions with Bathsheba, are typological of Christ. So glad we got that out of the way. Let's look at some examples. So Christ as the true Israel. What do I mean by true Israel? In Stephen Wellum's book, he says Jesus is the true Israel in the sense that eschatological fulfillment has come in Christ as he embodies the identity, vocation, and prophesied roles of corporate Israel. Jesus is the last Adam, the true servant, the true son, the ultimate prophet, the final priest, and the reigning exalted king, David's greater son. He is the true Israel in this sense, the faithful Israelite, in that he fulfills all that God had promised and intended for the nation of Israel. So let's lay out our case for how Jesus is this true Israel. Well, in the Old Testament, Jesus is presented as the antitypical Adam. Remember, like I said earlier in the video, Adam is this prototype of Jesus. So we see in Romans 5, Paul makes this connection, as well as in 1 Corinthians 15, the covenantal head of the new humanity, restoring them to dignity, the role for which they were created by undoing the curse. This was a role which Israel was expected to embody, but failed. 2, Christ is the true seed of Abraham, as we read in Galatians 3:16, and the promised ideal David, as it was said by Peter in Acts 2, by Paul in Romans 1, and by the writer of Hebrews in the 1st chapter, as well as the 5th chapter. The correspondence is not just in terms of identity, because he fulfills the eschatological goals and promises associated with each of the covenantal figures. So, for example, already in Matthew's genealogy and the opening chapter of Luke's gospel, the reader receives significant clues that the climax of Israel's story, the end of exile, the promises to Abraham and David are being fulfilled through Jesus. So Jesus, in a sense, as I said right here, that he recapitulates Israel's role as the son and fulfills the purpose that they were destined for. Next thing. Christ as the son out of Egypt, and probably the most direct typological correspondence between Israel and Christ is found in Matthew 2:15, where he quotes Hosea 11:1. It says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." It's fulfilled in Jesus's departure and a return from Egypt to avoid Herod. And it seems obscure for a moment, since Hosea 11:1 seems to be merely recollecting Israel's original exodus. But when you look really clear and in the broader context of Hosea 11, when that's considered, Hosea himself not only recalls Israel's exodus, idolatry, and God's judgment, but he also anticipates a future restoration, a future exodus from Egypt. Hosea 11:10 through 11. Moreover, the corporate identification of the people of Israel with a single individual representative, Jesus, is connected to the prophecy of the future king of Israel coming out of Egypt. This is in Numbers 24:7 through 9 and 24:17 through 19. It's echoed in Hosea 11:10 through 11. Numbers, for cross-reference, Numbers 23:22, 24:8 through 9. And in some Matthew's citation of Hosea 11:1, with reference to Jesus's flight to Egypt, it can only be understood in light of the broader context of Hosea 11. It serves two purposes. First, that Matthew identifies Jesus as God's son, the true Israel, who recapitulates and embodies Israel's history. And second, this son ushers in a new Exodus, commencing the restoration of Israel. Matthew believed that the return from exile promised in Hosea ultimately became a reality with the true Son of Israel, Jesus Christ. There's this further aspect of God's perspective of Jesus in the announcement where he says in Matthew 3:17, "This is my beloved son." It's also in Luke in 3:22, Luke 3:22. He recalls the sonship of Israel, echoing Exodus 4:22, Jeremiah 31:9, and possibly Jeremiah 38:20, where Ephraim is called my beloved son, the messianic enthronement psalm of the Davidic king in Psalm 2:7, and possibly Isaac in Genesis 22:2 and 12. The voice of out of heaven confirms Jesus as the unique Son of God, the true Israel and true King, summing up all that these previous sons anticipated. Christ as the true servant. When Jesus was going to be baptized, the Spirit descended upon Jesus. It was in this that God declared that this is the Son in whom he was well pleased with. This is a clear allusion to Isaiah 42:1. It's identifying Jesus as the Isaiah suffering servant. The servant named along with Jacob and Israel in Isaiah chapter 41, verses 8 through 9, 42:19, 43:10, 44:1-2, 21:26, 45, 48:20, 49:3. There is another servant, a faithful servant, anointed by the Spirit, who accomplishes Israel's salvation and restoration. In all these sections, particularly in Isaiah 52:19, 52:13 through 53:12, the servant is the true Israel, Isaiah 49:3, who accomplishes God's promises of deliverance to Israel. Not just in the narrative of Jesus' baptism, but throughout the New Testament, Jesus is presented as this suffering servant, the eschatological servant. Particularly in Mark, this is a major theme. Well, we see it also in Acts 3:26, Philippians 2:7, 1 Peter 2:21-25. Moreover, Jesus fulfills the servant Israel's mission by his atoning death, like in Isaiah 53, Romans 4:23-25, and Galatians 1:4. It's in cleansing and restoring Israel, and also in Israel's task to the nations, as indicated by Luke 2:32. Jesus is the light of all nations. It's therefore that Jesus does not restore the nation of Israel in order to bless the nations in the future. He accomplishes this task in his first coming. Christ as the obedient son in wilderness. The Israel-Christ typological relationship is further evident in the wilderness temptation. This is in Matthew 4:1-11 and Luke 4:1-13. It's having identified with Israel in his baptism, this son is led into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by Satan. It mirrors Israel's wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. Jesus was triumphant. Israel was not. And finally, we have another example of this relationship that's found in John 15:1. Jesus is the true vine. John presents Jesus as the true vine as opposed to the false apostate vine as Israel was. The most significant and important Old Testament allusion that backgrounds John 15 is Psalm 80. We saw that last episode, where the symbol of the vine is bound up with the psalmist's cry for restoration, his recall of the Exodus, and his plea for God to raise up his eschatological Son of Man. The prophecy of restoration of the vine through a son, the king, is fulfilled in Jesus. Up to this point in John's gospel, Jesus has superseded the temple, the Jewish feasts, Moses, various holy sites. Here, he supersedes Israel as the very focus of the people of God. According to John 15, 1 through 8, only those who organically are united with the true vine, incorporated as branches bearing fruit, are participants in Jesus, the true Israel. So that's all I have. Again, this is a very, very brief, but I think a welcome way to explore the scriptures in such a way that would add depth and meaning to your reading, to your study. I hope this blesses you. Let me know what you guys think. I'm going to upload this and have it available tomorrow. But please please comment, please subscribe. I'm going to end this here now, and you guys have a great day.